Every year there are players that come out of nowhere and absolutely dominate in fantasy football. Guys that you're getting at the very end of your draft, maybe not even drafting, that end up being key cogs in a championship run. I'm going to help you identify two guys that could be that at the wide receiver position in 2023. Garrett Price back again, dynastynerds.com and the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. And I want to take a look at two guys at the wide receiver position that could be this year's breakout wide receiver. Now, we see this happen every year. A guy that comes out of basically nowhere and ends up being a high-end wide receiver 2, maybe even a low-end wide receiver 1. Looking back at our notes, 2-3 years ago, Marvin Jones, Detroit Lions, ended up being wide receiver 18 out of nowhere. 2 years ago, Hunter Renfrow, wide receiver 10 out of nowhere. And last year, Christian Kirk, out of nowhere, was wide receiver 11. So we see this happen almost every single year where a wide receiver comes out of nowhere and ends up being a real difference maker for fantasy football teams. Looking back at the last 3 guys that did it over the past 3 seasons, there is a common thread. And that common thread is opportunity. These are guys that in the past maybe didn't have a ton of opportunity, but because of the lack of talent around them and potentially some injuries, they had the opportunity to really accelerate and do amazing in that given season. Now, these aren't guys that we necessarily are still wanting to roster as key cogs in our dynasty teams, but they could help us for this year. So the two guys that I want to look at, the first one here, DeVante Parker. Now, the two guys that were ahead of him at the wide receiver position that had more targets, they're gone. And even that, Parker did better in targets per game than basically anybody at the position other than Jakobi Meyers. Jakobi Meyers is gone. He's basically the lead dog. He's the X. And he had 2 games during his campaign where he was just absolutely dominant. A game with over 150 yards and another game where he had nearly 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. So we know that he still has it in him to make those big plays in those big games, but it's just a comfort level with the quarterback. Can he stay healthy and can he be comfortable? I think both of those things are a real possibility. And now that the threat of DeAndre Hopkins is gone, those targets have to go somewhere. Really, the only other thing they added was at the tight end position. They added Mike Gesicki, but they got rid of Jonnu Smith. So the target differentiation there is probably not going to be too drastic. We will probably see it mostly dip for Hunter Henry, but at the wide receiver position, it really looks like DeVante Parker could be that diamond in the rough really late in your drafts that's going to have the opportunity to way outperform his ADP. The other guy I want to look at here is Darius Slayton. Darius Slayton has had hot and cold moments all throughout his career. Remember, his rookie season, he was being talked about in the same breath as some of the DK Metcalfs and AJ Browns because of how much production he had in that first year. Now, obviously, we didn't expect him to put up the same kind of numbers long-term, mostly because of the draft capital, and we just thought those guys were a little bit better. But Darius Slayton has always just kind of hung around with the New York Giants, and at the beginning of this year, it really looked like things were just done for him. He wasn't going to be a thing anymore for the New York Giants. But injuries happened, and he worked his way back into the good graces of his coaching staff, and then he started taking off. During the middle part of the season, he actually had 5 games where he was a wide receiver 2 or better. 5 games. He was becoming a legitimate asset. Now, he got banged up again at the end of the year, so we didn't get to see quite how these things would finish out. But with them bringing him back, I really thought he was going to be on a different team. But they liked him enough to bring him back. I think he is still going to be a focal point of this offense, and he could be one of those players that you can get way late in your drafts that could sneak into that boom territory out of nowhere. Because let's be honest, what other targets are there? I mean, Wan'Dale Robinson, Hodgins, yes, maybe even Jalen Hyatt, the guy they just drafted. But all of these guys are unproven. We don't know what we're getting out of them. Slayton's actually got the most history, do we want to go with? He's got the most experience out of all these guys. We've seen him do it more so than the other ones. Any one of these guys, sure, any one of these guys could hit. But my money's on Darius Slayton. Look, both Parker and Slayton are absolute long shots. There's a reason they're getting drafted as late as they are. There are some absolute warts there, but there's a real opportunity for some real targets for these players. And I think that I'm going to be drafting them, especially in redraft, but even in Dynasty. I want these guys on the back of my bench for bye weeks, injuries, or just in case they boom and they're that breakout player at wide receiver for 2023.